It's 2021, and we're still talking about COVID. I chose to title the presentation "To Mandate or Not to Mandate." That is the question, to borrow from a Shakespearean reference from Hamlet. And I promise you that's where the Shakespeare stops, so you're not totally going to be put to sleep this afternoon. But that does seem to be the question on everyone's mind, not just in the local government world, but in our country and the world at large. And we're going to tackle that issue and related issues today during this next 45 minutes to an hour that we'll spend together. As Dan mentioned, we have set this up, and it was Dan's idea, which is a great idea, I think, to do this as a question and answer format so that you are really getting exactly what you want out of the presentation. So we have had questions submitted to Dan that have come to me. I've gotten some directly also through the ACCG helpline. And so this presentation is going to go through those questions. We've been getting questions even through today, so this may not be the prettiest PowerPoint you've ever observed, but hopefully it's going to be complete because we really wanted to make sure that we included everything that you wanted to know about. As to the PowerPoint, I've provided that to Dan, and he'll be sending that out, I think, Dan, right, to everyone?
Yes, I'll send out the presentation along with the recording. So
okay,
I think
super.
Good.
And so
before you go on, Angela, somebody had mentioned that they're having trouble hearing. If you're having trouble, I had one person mention it, so I'm not sure if it's an issue out there besides just one person. Let me know. If not, I will deal with that on another personal level. So go ahead, Angela. Sorry about that.
Okay. So you are going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, and as we go through, you'll see that there's some links embedded that you can click into and give you a little bit more information on some of these topics if you wish. One of the things I want to say before we get going is that, this is a brand new world that we're living in. Every day, things are evolving and changing, and that is no exception with what's happening in your job. And I know everybody, I thought it was kind of funny when Dan asked each person how they doing. There's sort of a sigh and an okay, and I think that's just kind of how we all feel. It's a sigh, and we're all just doing the best we can, but it's changing constantly. And so what we talk about right now is the best I can share with you based upon what the law is today. The last time I think I spoke to COVID issues on a webinar, then later that afternoon the EEOC came up with new guidance. Fortunately, I had kind of forecasted most of it, so my webinar was still relevant, but I just offer that to say that what we hear today could be different tomorrow, and we could have new considerations. So please just know that if you have questions or you see things changing or see things in the press, please feel free to reach back out to me through the ACCG helpline if you're a county, or on the GMA side if you're a city, or your city or county attorney. So I just wanted to preface it with, it's always changing, so I want to make you aware of that. So now, in terms of the question and answer, that is the plan for today. But also, I wanted to start with just an overview of the legal issues, because I think once I do this and I tell you what legal issues are in play, then you're going to be able to answer many of your questions yourself. And that's not my goal. It's not self-service here. But what my goal is that you have an understanding on a very basic level of what to worry about, so that as nuances of questions come up, maybe we didn't get every question here that you'll get tomorrow, then you'll have a sense of where to go with that and how to approach it. My mother always told me, when you tell your kids no, it's always best if you explain to them why. And as I've been a parent now, I'm not sure that's always true, but I do see the value in explaining your yes and no answers, because then hopefully the next time you can make a better informed choice. So I'm not calling y'all my kids, but happy to think of you that way as well. But what I want to convey is that I want to share with you just some basics before we get to the questions, and hopefully that will help you when you have that question come up and you need to pick your yes or no answer. So without further ado, here on the first screen, I'm showing you just a litany of laws that are involved, and this may be far more than you've ever dreamed of. So when you talk about, should I develop a mandatory policy, these are all the things that are pinging in my head. The EEO laws, which include Title VII, ADA, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. We've got constitutional claims, Section 1983 claims. We've got workers' compensation issues. There's First Amendment and Georgia Whistleblower Act implications. The incentive programs in and of themselves raise all of those issues above, and then some in terms of taxable issues as well. There's some intangible issues, just like this topic impacting your employee-employer relationships in the workplace. And then we're even going to touch upon some questions that I've received related to inmates. So for any of you who are governments that have to function and care for jails and worry about what's going on in the jails, then I'm also touching upon inmates and how that applies to these issues. So we're going to walk through just some basics here. The EEO laws are covered by the EEOC. So Title VII, ADA, and the Genetic Information Act are the ones that are applicable to what we're talking about today. The EEOC has recently provided some guidance specifically concerning COVID-19. And once you get this PowerPoint from Dan, you'll be able to click this link, which will go through some detail in what we're talking about today. And I just wanted you to know that existed so you can have it for future reference. Interestingly, pre-COVID-19, the EEOC has some guidance called the Pandemic Preparedness in the Workplace. And here's the link for that as well. Interestingly, in that guidance, the EEOC concluded that the ADA covered employees should consider simply encouraging employees to get the influenza vaccine, that's what was in play at the time, rather than requiring them to take it. So while that's pre-COVID, and certainly the COVID pandemic is quite different, it was interesting to me that this was put in a document titled Pandemic Preparedness, and the EEOC at that time is recommending against mandatory vaccine policies. Now, looking at each of these laws really quickly, again, just for foundational purposes, so I'm just going to blow through these. I just want you to be aware. So the ADA, which is probably something if you're HR professionals you're dealing with all the time, the things you have to think about if you're adopting a mandatory policy is, one, you're going to have to be able to show that there's a business necessity or a direct threat to the health and safety of the employees that requires you to have this mandatory vaccine policy. Then you're going to have to look at, well, how do you draft it? Is it narrowly tailored? So if it applies to everybody without any concern as to whether they even see other people or see other public citizens or engage with other employees, then maybe it's not tailored narrowly enough. If it applies only to public safety, then maybe you're getting closer to tailoring it to people that it would really most likely need to be addressing. Also, you're going to have to deal in any policy with exemptions for disability, and also then we'll talk about religion in just a moment. So these are just some things to think about. If you had a mandatory policy, you also have to consider the notion of someone coming to you and saying, well, I have a disability or some kind of medical reason that I can't be vaccinated, so I cannot comply with your mandatory policy. If that's the case, then you have to worry about going through the reasonable accommodation process. And I'm going to talk here globally about this because then when we get to the specific questions, I think they'll make a lot more sense to you. Here's my concern about a mandatory policy, and you'll see pretty quickly that I'm recommending against mandatory policies because I think there's a lot of legal liability issues, but most importantly, I think there's a lot of practicality issues that for you administering a mandatory policy makes it almost untenable. So here's a scenario. Say you have a mandatory policy, and we know based upon an AP poll, and really just if you just talk to anybody out in the public, you know it's probably about a 50-50 split right now in America as to whether people believe in vaccination for the COVID or whether they don't believe or support getting vaccinated for COVID. So because that's so divisive right now and it's such a new vaccine and such a new issue, you have to imagine that you may have about half of your workforce who are going to, even if they don't have a legitimate reason to come forward with an exception, they may come up with one. And I hate to say it like that, but you know that sometimes happens. So say an employee comes up and says, oh, you know, I have asthma and therefore I can't take the COVID vaccine, or I have, you know, this disability, so I'm not going to be able to take it. And, you know, they can probably get a doctor's note to say whatever it is they wish to be said. Again, I'm sorry, I'm speaking as a skeptical lawyer, but I'm sure if you've done HR long enough, you feel just as skeptical sometimes. But suppose that someone comes forward, and there will be some legitimate, please know, there'll be a lot of legitimate indications where someone says, I can't take the vaccine because of a medical issue. So when they say that, you have to engage then in the interactive process, and you have to determine, well, what reasonable accommodation can I make? Well, the law says that we can't exclude someone if they're not following our rules under the ADA, but we have to decide if there's a reasonable accommodation. So what you would have to naturally be considering is there a way for them to telework? That's going to be the most likely reasonable accommodation. Or is there a way to have them in a private office setting that you believe meets the needs of the organization without requiring mandatory vaccination? In doing that, think about it. If you have about half your workforce, or even if it's a quarter of your workforce, who comes to you and says, I have a disability exemption need, or we'll talk about in a second, a religious belief that causes me to be entitled to an exemption, then you've got a massive amount of people that you're trying to deal with in terms of reasonable accommodation. So other than putting them all out working from home, which would be potentially a reasonable accommodation, your other alternative is then to fire those people. So either way, you end up completely decimating a large portion of your workforce, either by sending them home to telework, which may or may not be productive and desirable for your local government. And certainly for some jobs, it's just not feasible. Or you decimate your workforce because you've separated a ton of people because they can't comply with your mandatory policy, and you're taking a position that reasonable accommodation creates an undue hardship and you can't offer it. So is that practical? That's the question I'll leave you with. And from my perspective, I fear that it's really very difficult to apply those practically if you were to adopt a mandatory policy. Another thing you need to think about with the ADA is whether the vaccine constitutes a medical exam, because that leads to all other kinds of considerations, but it's pretty clear that it does not. However, pre-screening questions are disability-related inquiries that you have to be careful about. So just like when we talk about, hey, don't ask someone about their personal health information, be careful, caution, caution. Well, if you have a vaccination program, particularly if you're trying to implement it yourself in the county, then there's going to be pre-screening questions about pre-existing conditions and health-related issues, and you need to treat those as disability-related inquiries, and then they need to be job-related and consistent with business necessity, and you find yourself then in that whole rat race of making sure you're complying with the ADA with respect to the information that you're requesting and you're receiving from these individuals about the private medical information. And then also, of course, HIPAA would be in play as to how you would maintain and record this information. So my advice is going to be, if you decide you want a mandatory policy after today, then I highly recommend that you don't implement it yourself. Make them go out and get their vaccine wherever they want to get it and bring you a proof of vaccination, as opposed to trying to implement a program where you're doing pre-screening questions and then you're maintaining all this private health data. Religious freedom is the other issue under Title VII. It's applied really just like what I spoke about. If someone comes forward and says, my religious beliefs are such that I cannot get the vaccination, and you have a mandatory program, then you're going to have to go through the same considerations. They need to demonstrate there's a sincerely held religious belief, but I can tell you that under the law, religion is defined so broadly, that's really almost anything. So it'd be very hard to say, no, that's not sincerely held. So you might as well assume that that religious belief is going to justify consideration further. And that further consideration requires you to consider, again, a reasonable accommodation. So again, if you have a big group of people coming forward saying, I got a disability, and another big group coming and saying, well, I've got religious beliefs that contravene my ability to get this vaccination, then is that practical? You're going to be doing nothing but reasonable accommodation analysis. And I know if you're in HR, you know how complicated that can be just when you have one or two at a time, but you could have 25 to 50% of your workforce. And again, that concerns me with respect to practicality. There's also something called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that falls under EEOC's guidance. And there, it's very clear that you can't ask pre-screening questions about genetics, or that would be a violation of rights. Again, if you're going to do a mandatory policy, farm that out. Don't do it yourself. Don't ask the questions, because otherwise you just have more exposure to liability. Now, other considerations legally, Section 1983, which you've probably heard if you work a lot in government and also particularly with law enforcement, and then other constitutional claims. I'm not going to detail all this with you to any great degree, but I just wanted you to see them. So when we talk about, should I do a mandatory, should I not do a mandatory, these are other things to worry about. So under the Constitution, there's a liberty interest that's been recognized in an individual's right to make decisions about his or her body and about medical treatment. There has to be a compelling government interest, and it has to be narrowly tailored. So that's going to be a consideration of whether this mandatory policy is legal. Is it violating a liberty interest? Also under the Constitution, as you well know, is the First Amendment, which has a free exercise of religion clause. So again, is this mandatory policy invading the free exercise of religion? The analysis there, if it's a neutral policy, then you have to determine what the rational basis for the policy is. And these are just additional considerations and potential liability traps for you if you have a policy of mandated vaccine. Now I'm going to move into sort of another area, but again, an underlying foundation for you as you go forward with our questions, and that's workers' compensation, something you may not have even thought about. Well, if you have a mandatory policy and you said you must be vaccinated, that's really no different than saying you must appear on this job site or you must do this job duty. It's a condition of employment. As a condition of employment, then it would be arising out of and in the course of employment, which is the quoted phrase there, and the buzzwords for workers' compensation claims. Now, in Georgia, there's no reported case to date on vaccinations. Of course, none on COVID, but none on older vaccinations like flu vaccination programs or anything like that. But there are a variety of cases in other states, many states, that have addressed this and found that a required vaccination program would indeed give rise to a workers' compensation claim if the employee is injured, becomes sick, or dies. And there have been quite a few reports of injuries and even death with respect to the COVID vaccine. So you need to be prepared that it could be an issue to be considered also under workers' compensation. The First Amendment and the Whistleblower Act are other considerations. You know, in a vacuum, when you adopt a policy like this, there's the direct relation of what's going to happen. So are we going to be liable for the policy? But then there's also a lot of things that surround the policy that can potentially be spin-off liability issues. So this is a spin-off, if you will. So say you have employees that are complaining, speaking out, posting on Facebook about your mandatory policy. You know, you've got the anti-vaxxers here saying you're invading my privacy rights. You've got the people who want to be vaccinated to say my employer's trying to kill me because they're making me come to work without a vaccine policy. You can get it on either side. So when you put this issue squarely in the workplace with a policy, you've got to be prepared to deal with how you will handle people talking about it. So free speech under the First Amendment can give rise to violations, and also violations for retaliation if someone speaks either in a post or in the workplace in a matter of public concern on these issues. Now, if it's a personal grievance they're bringing, that's a different thing and is going to be an issue that potentially you can deal with from a disciplinary basis. But if they're speaking on a matter of public concern, then that's going to be protected speech. And we really have to be careful about how we would treat that from a disciplinary basis. The Whistleblower Act is similar. If you've got employees that are disclosing or whistleblowing on any of these activities, and those are going to be protected activities and issues that you just might not expect. So again, I just want to give you a little bit of here's what you're biting off on, and I want you to think about before you engage in these programs. Incentive programs, we're going to address quite a few questions on this because my sense is most government employers, and maybe really even employers throughout the country, have determined that mandatory programs are just a little too risky and also a little too controversial. And so the incentive programs appear to be where people are finding themselves trying to determine, how do I develop an incentive program? And I'm going to address a lot of your questions on that. Here's the basics. Is it a part of your wellness program? You've got to make that determination. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that, but I think keeping it separate from your wellness program is good because your wellness program contains a lot of other requirements that you have to fulfill. So I think putting it under your wellness program is just going to mean you have to comply with a lot of additional requirements with a lot of more concerns. It's important on an incentive program that you consider that it's a de minimis benefit only if you want it to be deemed a voluntary program. And for heaven's sakes, if you put an incentive program in that's a hammer instead of a carrot, such that it's construed by a court as a mandatory program, then you might as well have done your mandatory vaccination program. So we want to make sure that it is indeed going to be construed as voluntary if you're interested in an incentive program. That means de minimis benefit only. And then even still here, we get the clincher that we have to deal with reasonable accommodations for disability and religious beliefs. And I'm going to talk about that when I answer your questions. Another just big picture topic I want you to think about, as I mentioned earlier, there's an AP poll out, and there's probably 10 or 20 others demonstrating this divisiveness on this issue. Roughly 50% want to be vaccinated, 50% don't want to be vaccinated. So just consider that political debate and the disruption to your workplace that could come about, irrespective of a mandatory or even a incentive-based program. Lastly, we're going to run through consideration of inmates. And this question has come up a lot from sheriff's offices and police chiefs, where they are dealing with inmates, some who are demanding vaccinations, some who say, no way, don't vaccinate me. There's a lot of the same considerations that I've listed here. There's a couple of different and additional considerations considering the 8th and 14th Amendment in terms of deliberate indifference to medical care, and then excessive force. And there's also something called RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. All of those things are going to come in play if your local government decides to have some type of mandatory or even incentive-based inmate policy. All right, let's get to the questions. So that was a lot, but hopefully that'll give you just sort of a basic understanding of all the many issues that are out there that we have to grapple with each time we're trying to address one of your questions. So I'm going to start first with just general considerations. Here's one question we got. Can a city or county require its employees to take the COVID-19 vaccine? So that's the $1 million to be or not to be question, and the most basic question we're covering today. So can we require it? So my answer is I don't recommend it. Could you possibly draft a mandatory policy that's legal? Yes, possibly. There would have to be a lot of nuances in your exceptions and a lot of consideration of applying it. But I think it possibly could be done, but it's not recommended. And I don't see this being where the majority of employers are going on this issue because of all the potential liability and because of the practical issues that I mentioned earlier, namely just the fact that reasonable accommodations could just be coming at you left and right with a substantial portion of your workforce. And then you're in the very difficult position of either sending people home as an accommodation to remove them from the workplace or terminating them if they can't be vaccinated based upon disability or religion. Next question. Can an employee be fired for not taking the COVID-19 vaccine if required by their employer? So this is sort of a variation on the last question, but again, I wanted to address these specifically. The answer is possibly, and I'm sorry, many times in law and HR, as you know, there's not a bright line yes and no. Yes, potentially they could be fired, but you have to go through the exemptions. You have to consider disability. You have to consider the exemption for religious beliefs and make sure that you go through an interactive reasonable accommodation process. And even then, there's still some landmines for these types of mandatory policies, like I mentioned, with liberty interest to make your own bodily health decisions and a variety of other things that I mentioned earlier. So it's a possibly. Next question. Can employees be forced to take the vaccine even if it's not FDA approved? And so, as you know, right now, we are working under what is an emergency use authorization. So the FDA has not approved as of yet the vaccinations. It was all fast-tracked. And so I've gotten a question, I think it's a good one. And I would suggest that it does increase your risk when it hasn't been fully vetted through the typical FDA process, that you could be finding yourself with even more concerns and considerations than if it were a normally fully vetted FDA approved vaccination. So that's just one more thing for you to consider. So if you are debating and really leaning towards the mandatory policy, you might consider whether you wait until there's FDA approval of vaccines before you proceed. Next question. What should the employer do if an employee claims an exemption to your policy based on disability? So I bet you can answer this question now because I've already taught you what you have to worry about, right? I wish we were all sitting in a room where I could call out and you could raise your hands or yell it out. But the answer is you're going to have to go through an interactive process to determine whether there's a reasonable accommodation. So can you exclude the person from the workplace because they're going to violate your mandatory policy? Perhaps, but you have to consider the reasonable accommodation requirement. And ultimately, the law says if you cannot provide a reasonable accommodation in the absence of an undue hardship, then you can separate the employee. But again, there's the practicality issues. If you have quite a few requests for accommodations, how are you going to handle those? Because obviously you have to handle them all the same way. So if everyone who wants a reasonable accommodation, if you put one out to telework, unless you can really show that one particular job is susceptible to teleworking and another one is not, then you really have to treat people the same and certainly consistently. Similar question, what do we do if the an employee claims an exemption to your policy, your mandatory policy, based upon having a sincerely held religious belief? Again, I bet you can answer this question now. You got to go through the interactive process. You've got to figure out what reasonable accommodation could be made. Do they get to telework, or do you end up terminating? So those are really hard decisions to be made, and particularly, as I mentioned, if you have a volume of people coming forward with these religious exceptions. All right, let's switch gears to workers' compensation. So I bet you can answer this question now, but I got this question from one of you listeners and viewers. If your employee gets the virus from the vaccine and gets sick or even dies from complications, will this result in a workers' compensation claim? And again, I wish you're sitting right in front of me, because I bet you would all say yes, and that's true. Arising out of and in the course of employment is the standard for workers' compensation claims. When it's a condition and a requirement of employment, like a mandatory policy, then indeed I believe it will give rise to workers' compensation claims. I say likely yes instead of a resounding yes, because there hasn't been a Georgia case that has addressed vaccination injuries, but a variety of other states have, and I feel quite sure that that's how it would go here in the state of Georgia as well. Now, even if you have an incentive-based program, I would consider how involved you are with it from a workers' compensation standpoint. Here I say you should consider where you administer the vaccinations, when you administer the vaccinations. Is it during working hours, or is it somewhere else? Is it on your work site, or is it at the doctor's office? And who's administering it? Are you bringing in your nurse from your insurance company? Is it a Kaiser representative and you're insured by Kaiser and they're coming and sitting in your lobby and doing it? If so, you're getting very entangled in the process. I wouldn't recommend that. That starts looking a lot more heavy-handed, even for incentive-based programs. And also consider who pays for it. So all of those considerations would come into play in determining whether there's going to be a workers' compensation claim that would be met with these types of either sickness or injury. And even Dr. Fauci, I don't know if you saw it, but he said he was, I think the phrase was, knocked out for a few days with, he said it wasn't sickness, but he described it, I think, as being fatigued, clammy. I can't remember all the description, but I'm just saying even our top doctor has had some pretty substantial reactions. So if someone misses work for a few days, you know, that could be a workers' comp claim that they would file with that type of sickness or injury following a workers' comp required vaccination program. All right, incentive programs. I think this is probably the biggest topic of interest. And again, I think this is probably where most people are landing and where your local government officials are probably focusing their time and interest. So what my goal is today is to give you all this background and this information so that you can answer their questions about what programs you might implement in your city or county. So the most basic of questions is, can a city or county offer an incentive for an employee who receives the COVID vaccine? And the answer is yes, but there's a but. And you probably know a lot of the buts because we've talked about them in our foundational training at the start of this webinar. First of all, you need to determine, is it part of your wellness program? I have seen some employers, not necessarily government employers, but even private employers who are touting that the COVID vaccination is part of their wellness program. I would discourage you from doing that because then it wraps it up in all of those requirements, many of which then means there's much more of a connectability to the employer and the employee with respect to the vaccine, including the pre-vaccination questions that are required, the maintenance of health records, and all of those things. I think it's better if you're inclined to do an incentive program that you keep it separate and apart from your wellness program and you let it just be freestanding, and certainly not link it up, as I have seen some employers doing very, very specifically. Also, it's a yes, but you're going to have to consider, what about those people who say, well, I would really like that carrot incentive that you're offering, but I have a disability or I have a religious belief such that I can't do that vaccination. So I need you, instead of the carrot, you need to give me an apple. I need some kind of alternative benefit. So if you have those types of situations, you really do have to consider what's your reasonable accommodation, or in this sense, it would be your alternative benefits. So if I've offered a carrot and Joe can't take the carrot because he has a disability or religious belief that precludes his vaccination, then I got to give Joe an apple. And that is a very difficult consideration, and we'll talk about it more in this setting, is what are those alternative benefits? What can you offer that would make sense in this type of incentive program? And then finally, yes, but you have to make sure it's a voluntary program. Again, if you're going the incentive route, it's because you've probably determined that the mandatory vaccination program is too risky. So don't fall on your sword and in trying to do an incentive program, create such a high valued incentive that it's all but mandatory. And that would be, something like, for instance, it's voluntary, but if you don't do it, you don't get insured anymore. We're taking away your ability to get insurance. Obviously, that's not only a huge valued incentive, but it's punitive. So you can't do things like that. Also, if you offer something that's more than de minimis, the EEOC is specifically going to look at that and say, well, the higher you increase the value, the more it's hard for someone to say no, and the more it's not truly a voluntary program. So that may diminish any benefit, honestly, that you can get out of an incentive program when you have to really diminish what that incentive can be. Now, the EEOC has proposed rules on wellness programs as of January 7th. And this is kind of interesting. There was a case, I think it was in the Southern District of New York, where the EEOC's previous comments and rules that provided that a wellness program could offer an incentive up to 30% of the insurance premiums for people that participate in wellness programs. Now, that was not COVID, that was all pre-COVID, but the court struck it down and said a 30% incentive, or another side of it is to see it as a 30% penalty, is too great. That makes it non-voluntary because it's so significant. So as a result of that, that program and those rules were struck. So now the EEOC was sent, per the court's order, back to the drawing board to create new rules and regulations. The EEOC has put out these proposed rules on January 7th. Now what happens is there's a 60-day comment period, but I understand that the new administration has frozen that comment period, which is not terribly uncommon, in order for them to process the issue a little more slowly. But that means these rules are in play. We don't know exactly where they'll land. The comment period is much like a public hearing in our local government world, where people are able to comment on what they'd like to see different and changed. And so these rules could be significantly different, but I put links here so that you can take a look at them. The reason I think this is real important is because I think, as I mentioned, many of the incentive programs will either fall under a wellness program by intent or may be construed as being part of the wellness program. But in either event, I think it's important guidance, because even though it doesn't speak specifically to COVID in any of these rules, I think it's setting up some good guidance for us as to what can be an appropriate incentive in our COVID context as it sets the rules in the wellness program context. Another related question: would a vaccine incentive program be considered a wellness program? So I've just talked about that a little bit, and my answer is it depends. And again, I just have mentioned it, so I won't go into this again in more detail, but if you establish the incentive program separately and you don't engage in participating in the administration of the vaccine, you don't participate where it's given, who it's given to, you simply say, hey, bring me proof of your vaccination, and then you get this incentive. That's how I would recommend your incentive program being developed if you're going to do one, that you're not engaging in the process, you're not setting up, doctors, nurses, healthcare providers in your facilities and running people through, but instead you have sort of an arm's length transaction of the process. I think that would be best, and then it would be less likely to be construed as a wellness program that would carry with it all the additional rules and considerations. Question. This was one from this morning, from Bullitt County, if I recall. Would a gift card or cash equivalent as a vaccine incentive be taxable to employees? Well, I have a tax team here at my firm, but I won't profess to be a tax professional, but this one is fairly easy to answer because it is specifically addressed in the IRS regulations. The answer is yes. If there's a cash equivalent, so you're either given a monetary award or you're giving a gift card, then currently under IRS rules, it's going to be taxable. That can be sort of administrative nightmare, not only for the employees, but also for your finance staff. Now, if there's a non-cash de minimis fringe benefit, that's not taxable. So if you give employees a water bottle, they're not going to tax the value of that water bottle. But if it's cash or cash equivalent, like a gift certificate or gift card, it will indeed be taxable. Now, I want to give a caveat because as the EEOC is developing rules in more detail on what these incentive programs can look like in the wellness context, it's very likely that the IRS may review those rules. And so there could be changes on this with the IRS in terms of what's taxable and what's not. But as of right now, I would tell you if you put an incentive program in place with a cash or cash equivalent award, then consider that to be taxable to your employees. And I'll just back up and say this, as I mentioned earlier, when you have to have such a de minimis benefit, and if you're going to give a gift card or a gift certificate or cash, which is probably the most desirable benefit, and they get taxed on it, you start getting to where you have to ask yourself, have you accomplished anything? Have you given a benefit that anyone even cares about? Have you really encouraged and incentivized vaccination? And have you met any goals while putting yourself in this place of potentially having to deal with all the administration of a program or dealing with any potential liability? So you really have to weigh that out. It's what are you going to accomplish and can you meet your goals? So in terms of determining such questions, this question came up, what kind of incentive is appropriate? Well, the EEOC is going to say it has to be de minimis if we look to the equivalent wellness rules that are out there so far. In those EEOC proposed rules, they speak specifically of a water bottle as an example of a de minimis gift as an incentive. And they also mention a nominal amount. That's the phrase that is used. Now, the rules don't say anywhere what a nominal amount would be. In my mind, and there's no support for this legally, but I think $25. I think if you get over $25, it's very likely that you've exceeded a nominal amount if you're looking to do a gift card or some kind of cash value incentive award. Otherwise, things like water bottles or perhaps a pen set or things that would be useful in the workplace or at home. But those kind of values, I think you would have to find would be in that $10 to $25 range to meet with the examples given by these EEOC rules and also to meet with the de minimis standard. So if that doesn't really sound exciting, what kind of incentive could be appropriate? Well, we just talked about this, and I think this slide might be out of place actually because this is talking about the taxability. I apologize. And that is out of place. I apologize. Let me skip along here. I told you I put this together fast with these last questions, and all the last questions that came in today were about the incentive program. And so these are duplicated. And actually, you know what? It's my crazy self going backwards. I'm going to apologize for that. Okay. So sorry, everyone. Okay. So what kind of incentive would be appropriate? So based upon the EEOC's proposed rules, as I mentioned, it's de minimis. And we want to make sure it's de minimis so the program is considered voluntary. Now, the decisions on what to offer become more and more risky the greater the reward is that we offer. So if you're given a water bottle that's valued at $5, I don't think you have to worry about the EEOC or anyone coming in and saying that's not a voluntary program because that reward is so great. But as you increase the rewards, and again, I would recommend not going over $25, then you're more likely to get to a place where it could be construed by the EEOC or a court as a mandatory program. Here's some other options that I have thought about and had tossed around. So if you want to avoid the cash option because of the taxability to the employees or not wanting to really tread too closely on what might be de minimis or not, here's a concept in using potentially paid time off. So if you want to encourage vaccination, but you don't want the risk of not only having it deemed to be involuntary, but also not dealing with those people who are going to come forward and say, well, I can't get the carrot, give me the apple, those alternative demands, then some option would be to offer paid time off to all employees. Maybe give them 2 hours or half a day that you just put in their PTO bank, and you do it across the board for all the employees. And you indicate that that is vaccination available time. And they can take the time if they want to go get a vaccine, or they can take the time to go get a Coke at the McDonald's or whatever they wish to do. But that is something that I've seen some employers consider. And it has some merit and interest to me, because if you do it across the board, one, it's easy to administer. You just put those couple of hours or half a day just in everybody's PTO banks. You announce what it's for, that the purpose and intent is for it to be available for any employees who wish to get vaccinated, but it's available to everyone, even if they don't wish to use it for vaccination. So you're not discriminating. It's demonstrably voluntary. It applies to everyone, and you don't have to deal with anyone coming forward saying, well, I need an exemption because I can't do the carrot and you got to give me an apple. So it really solves a lot of problems in my mind, yet still would potentially encourage people to use that time to be vaccinated. Another option that you could consider is giving paid time off only for those people who are going to get vaccinated. So, if they come forward, maybe they give you their vaccination record. They would have to prove that they got vaccinated, and they tell you how much time it took for them to do that within some kind of range. Maybe you say up to half a day. With proof of vaccination, you can be paid for that time, and you would administer it that way. Now, that could be done. I think that could be shown to be voluntary. It could be shown to be de minimis. I guess depending on the salary rate of the employee, but it's directly connected to getting the vaccination. So I think that could be viable, but you do have to worry. Now, what about that employee who says, well, I can't get the vaccination because I have a disability or have a religious belief, and I still want my time off, because I'm being discriminated against because I'm not offered that same time off. But again, what is your alternative to offer? That gets really, really difficult. Another option would be, do you just pay for the cost of the vaccines in the form of a voucher? So if someone wants to be vaccinated, you will agree to pay for that vaccination. I'm not crazy about that, because that just engages you in the process a little further. I like the arm's length transactions much better, but I've seen some employers that are considering that. So I just wanted to mention that as a potential option as well. Now, if we develop an incentive program that requires employees to show proof of vaccination, do we need to maintain that vaccine record on file? And when I got this question, the person went on to say, we really don't want to. We really don't want these vaccination records. We really don't want the headache of having all of this new private medical information. Well, unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. You do need to retain it. So if you're giving some kind of incentive, you need to be able to retain and show why you gave the incentive for any kind of financial audit or to support the incentive that was provided. So I do think you need to retain the record. The record should be treated as a medical record and protected as such. Now, I guess there's a chance that you could document it in a way that you don't keep the actual record. I think that could be considered, but I think you're going to have some record that the vaccination occurred, even if it's not the actual medical record. But even the fact of addressing the vaccination, I would still be careful, and I would put that in your medical records file and protect it under HIPAA. Okay, here's another question about incentive. Now, I will say, I'm not sure if I understood this question completely, and I've printed it exactly as it was presented. So if the person who asked this question is on and I didn't answer it, then please we'll pipe up and we'll get to it. Make sure I get the question correct. But here's the question. We have continued to follow FFCRA, all except the 2/3 pay for school being closed, even though we are not required to. So it sounds like they've extended it into 2021 to provide this additional leave. The question goes on and says, we are not making the vaccine mandatory for employees, but we are giving an incentive to those employees who do not get the vaccine. Can the city discontinue the FFCRA for those employees who elect not to get the vaccine, but continue it for those who do get the vaccination? And again, I'm not sure completely if I understand the question, but I think I do. And what my answer is, it's not recommended. And I'll answer this in a global way, so hopefully I catch the question however it was intended. My belief is, and my opinion is, that at this point, there's no guarantee that administration of the COVID-19 vaccine is 100% effective against preventing someone from being affected in the worst place. So even someone who gets the vaccine, they may need the leave. Someone who doesn't get the vaccine may never need the additional leave. So I really would discourage anyone from making an incentive based upon providing or not provided this special leave if you continue the leave policy. Because if you're continuing an extension of the FFCRA leave, then it's specifically for purposes of COVID infection or COVID quarantine. So I think if you utilize that leave as your incentive, and that's something that you apply, and you don't allow those who aren't getting the vaccine to be able to take that leave when they actually get sick with COVID, then I think that becomes much more punitive and could indeed be deemed discriminatory or retaliatory. Also, you also have the very real situation of dealing again with the accommodations issue. You know, did they not get the vaccination because either disability or a religious belief? So it's my opinion that if you're going to extend these emergency leave provisions, which many employers are doing, no obligation to do that, but many are doing it. If you do extend that leave, I would just leave that intact, and I would not try to touch that as part of an incentive program. I just think you're asking for trouble if you do that, because that's exactly how Congress, set it up initially to cover these COVID leaves. And even though you're extending it voluntarily, I just think you're opening a can of worms if you try to penalize someone by not allowing them to have that leave. Practically speaking, again, if you don't give them that leave and they've got COVID or they need to be quarantined, you want them out of the workplace. So then you've kind of dug yourself a hole, unless you want to just allow people to be out unpaid and on unpaid leave, which that's another quagmire that nobody really ever wants to get into, because you don't want to have a typical situation of unpaid leave, because that can really get abused. You need your people to come to work. So I think providing that leave is something that I would keep intact without involving it in your incentive program. Now here's some general leave questions that came out as well that I'm going to run through real quick. Can we extend the benefits under the FFCRA? That's what we were just talking about with the last question. And yes, you can, but you don't have to. It's largely going to probably be a budgetary decision for your governing authority. Can they afford to continue making these benefits available and this additional paid leave? For those who decide not to provide additional leave, I've gotten a ton of these questions through the helpline, so I'll just address it here for everyone. If you're not continuing the leave and someone has COVID or someone needs to quarantine, then you're left with just what's in your existing playbook. Does your existing personnel manual have personal or sick leave available for this person? Do they still have any accrued leave time? Is there a leave of absence option? Is FMLA applicable? You just have to go through what would be your typical tools in your tool shed to see what leave they would be entitled to if you decide to not continue the FFCRA. Now, who knows what will happen if this new administration will approve something different. I have a feeling we may see some changes here, but we don't know right now. And as of now, it would be voluntary to continue it. And again, if you don't, then you just have to deal with what's already in your personnel manual in terms of available leave options. Okay, can we require a public safety staff to use emergency paid sick leave if they've declined the COVID-19 vaccine or have not yet received the COVID-19 vaccine that is readily available. Here, if you've decided to extend, this is similar to the other question, and again, I'm not quite sure that I totally understand the question, but if the local government has decided to extend emergency paid sick leave, or you have some other type of emergency paid sick leave, I would caution you against requiring that it be used simply because the employee didn't get vaccinated, or refusing to allow them to take that leave because they didn't get vaccinated. Again, if you have a leave program, I would not penalize someone by not allowing them to have it. You know, I talked about a potential incentive of offering additional paid leave, but to take away something that's otherwise a global program, it's sort of semantics, and I get that, but I do think I would be concerned and would avoid that. So if you have a leave program, I would rather you add a couple hours and give that as your incentive as opposed to penalizing those who do not take the vaccine, because that seems much more like retaliation. Okay, real quick, a speech question. Can we fire or discipline an employee who's complaining about or speaking out against vaccines or our vaccine policy? I think this has been coming already for some cities and counties. And the question is, you probably can't, or the answer is probably not. You have to be really careful about firing or disciplining based on speech. There's a lot of nuances to this. So I've given you a fairly lengthy answer there that you can look through in the policies, because I know we're getting a little short on time. But by and large, you always want to be careful because of the First Amendment and the Whistleblower Act as to how the speech is portrayed and what the context is, where it's made, all those things before you consider whether you can fire or discipline based on that speech. So that's just not easy without having all of the details as to how the speech occurred. Now, inmates, I've gotten a lot of questions about this. So if you have a jail that you're administering with your sheriff's office, or you have city police, you know, are they required to receive the COVID-19 vaccine? As of right now, no. So inmates, there's no federal law, there's no Georgia law that mandates that inmates must be vaccinated. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, likewise, has not instituted a mandatory vaccination policy at this point. That could change, but as of now, that's a clear no. Would we face liability if we do not adopt a mandatory policy? So should you be adopting a mandatory policy? Again, I don't think there's going to be liability for refusing to have a mandatory policy and refusing to vaccinate everyone in jail. Again, there's these medical standards that I spoke about a little bit in the beginning about deliberate indifference to medical rights of inmates. But even still, I don't think, because the threshold is so high for these legal standards, that a failure to require all inmates to be inoculated by a COVID vaccine is going to give rise to liability necessarily. Would it present legal issues if you do it? And the answer to that is yes, just all the same considerations we've talked about. So still, I would say I wouldn't recommend a mandatory policy in a jail, even for inmates, because all of the same considerations, as well as the RLUIPA consideration, is in play. Okay, I'm gonna try to sum it up a little bit. So my overall, excuse me?
Hey, Angela, before you sum up, we've got a few more questions. So let's say if we can get through these, and we might go over a little bit. Just apologies for that, but it's good to have all these questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have an employee that has been out 3 times due to being exposed to someone with COVID, her test came back negative all 3 times, when can we say enough is enough?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a hard question. So here's what I would suggest. I've had similar issues even in my office, and I'll speak quietly because I'm sitting right here, where you've had employees that maybe are out multiple times, and even if the test was positive once and negative 2 more times, it's still problematic because you have someone out of the workplace repeatedly. Here's a few things I would recommend, because there's not a real easy answer. You know, typically you don't want to fire people simply because they are following the guidance of public health officials. That's where we're kind of caught here. It's not simply someone who's saying, I don't feel good, I'm not coming to work, but if they're following the quarantine, and likely not only the quarantine rules, but your own employer rules, and because they're following the rules, they're out of the workplace, that's a hard thing to fire on. But what I would suggest that you do is that you make sure that you're having documentation, and maybe you require some heightened documentation, and I would add that to your policy, maybe not just for this employee but across the board, so it doesn't appear that you're singling this employee out, where you have some requirements and you don't have something where an employee can just come in and say, oh, I was exposed to Joe who has COVID, but there is some requirement for some documentation. Now, that's still hard because you can get junk in, junk out, right? Isn't Joe just going to give her a letter and say, yeah, I'm Joe and I have COVID? But you could ask for some heightened documentation. You also have to worry about privacy rights of whoever that other person is that has been exposed. It's really, there's not an easy answer. My recommendation would be don't fire that person. But instead just make the standards for making sure that that person truly has been exposed. And then if you can, require them to work from home for those periods of time so that they're not totally unproductive. Now, it does not have to be paid. If they've exceeded, which I'm sure they have, their any kind of emergency paid leave that would have been available last year, maybe they have no more accrued time, then you don't have to pay them. But I also think if they're going to be out, you can require them to use any accrued time while they're out. So don't let them sit on a bank of vacation time while they're out 3 times for COVID. And sometimes that miraculously will mean that things are such that you don't keep getting reports. So if that employee is forced to use all their vacation time or forced to be at home unpaid, you might find that the reporting of these exposures is limited. I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but that would be my recommendation for any of my clients, is I would not fire straight up on that, because it's a difficult time right now where really everybody's being encouraged to have safety in the workplace, to follow CDC guidelines. And if that's what the employee's doing, it's really hard to fire on that.
Here's a couple more, Angela. A police agency, or can a police agency be sued if a citizen claims an officer gave them the virus?
That's an interesting question. I would say no to that, unless there's some allegation that there was some intentional act that resulted in the transmission of the virus. The reason I say that is because there is, that could happen with anyone, anywhere, and there's no ability to know really, as a matter of scientific fact, who conveys the virus to whom, where the virus may be picked up. So for one, there would be a causation issue that I cannot even see being provable. Now, could an inmate bring a claim? Sure, because inmates bring all kinds of claims. They have a lot of time on their hands, and I've seen some doozies. So I'm not saying that they might not bring the claim, but I think it would quickly get dismissed as frivolous. There'd be a lack of causation and a lack of culpability. So I would not worry about that being a viable claim.
Here's another question. Does an employee have to disclose the disability that exempts them from the vaccination?
That's a great question. So I think you would deal with it just like you deal with any other types of medical leave issues, FMLA, or so forth. So yes, I think they would. I think they would need to come forward with a doctor's note. And that's another thing that you would need to be sure to include in any kind of written policy you have, whether it be mandatory or an incentive program, is you're going to have in that policy provisions that deal with how you come forward with these requests for exemptions. And what I would do is go to like your FMLA provisions, and it really could mirror that. You have to provide a doctor's letter and explain what it is that they need, what the accommodations requested, and it would be processed very much like an FMLA interactive process. But yes, I do think they would need to disclose. They couldn't just come and say without documentation, I need an exemption for disability. It needs to be supported by medical documentation.
Very good. If FFCRA is extended, do county, state governments still receive the tax credit?
Well, if it's extended, well, okay, 2 things there. We don't get the same tax credits that private employers get from the outset. So unfortunately, as local governments, but whatever is done in the extension of FFRCA, who knows? I mean, I just don't know that I can answer that question, because I think it could look very different under this new administration. I don't know if it'll be simply in a continuation of the program. So I just don't know that I could answer that until we see what comes forward. As of now, though, there's nothing that would, at this time, currently be under federal law that would require you to give any kind of leave and therefore receive any kind of tax benefit.
One last question, and then I'll let you go. Can an employee's decision be or not to be vaccinated be used on a performance review?
I would not. Absolutely not. No. I mean, I think that has no place in terms of a performance. It should be very much treated like any other kind of medical issue. I'm sure you've had issues with employees who you feel like, has a workers' compensation claim every other day. It takes FMLA that you're not sure if it was really legitimate or if it's not. Maybe they even call in sick all the time. The sick leaves may be a little more questionable, but on the FMLA or workers' comp, I would never want to see anyone discipline an employee for utilizing what's available lawful medical leave. So I would not use that as any kind of performance indicator, because again, it's all wrapped up in medical issues or religious issues. So if they weren't vaccinated and it's because of disability or because of religion, then to ding them on a performance rating would be outright retaliation and discrimination. And I think that would be a really easy claim for the employee.
Very good. That's it. That's all the questions I have. So go ahead with your summary.
Okay. Well, it's all right there. Again, I think you hear me on this, that I'm not recommending a mandatory policy. I think there's just a lot of legal landmines. Maybe as things settle down and become more clear, I'll have a different approach and opinion, but I don't think so. I think all of these legal issues are still in play. And that's why I put you through the torture of hearing what some of those foundational legal issues are, is because I want you to realize there's a lot to it. And so if you've got a commissioner or a council member or a mayor or chairman pushing you for mandatory policy, I wanted you to feel comfortable that there's a lot of reasons and a lot of implications that have to be considered that someone just to the disconcerting eye may not realize. And so when you look at it with the wisdom that you have as HR professionals and officials after hearing this program, that there's a lot of reasons that you really have to take into account. So it's not my recommendation. The incentive program, I think, is a more appropriate place to land if you're intent on doing something in the vaccination arena. Again, though, I have some concerns about alternatives that you can make available. Remember, again, if Joe wants to be vaccinated but can't, and he can't get that carrot you're offering as your incentive, he's going to demand the apple. And what apple? What are we going to give them? And if you've got 25 to 50% of your workforce who are coming up with these reasons not to vaccinate, then you might as well be giving everybody the incentive, because that's what you'll end up doing by making these alternatives available. So that's still concerning. There's a lot of issues with incentive programs. Speech and disruption in the workplace is an intangible consideration, but I think it's really significant, and I think it's one you should really take into account when you're developing any of these policies. And finally, if you really want to do something and you're intent on doing something that enhances your safety in the workplace from a COVID standpoint, maybe you're getting a lot of pressure from your elected officials to do it or from your public, consider what other low-risk alternatives there might be that don't bring liability concerns or infringement on personal rights and disability and religious rights concerns. Which might include education policies and provisions. So maybe you have seminars and safety training that you require all the employees to go through, put on by health professionals or otherwise, where they talk more about the transmission of the virus and ways to avoid transmission of virus. Continue safety protocols like social distancing, wearing PPE, all of those things that you're probably continuing to do, maybe enhancing those in ways that show your commitment to this issue. But again, if you're interested in COVID safety, there might be other ways. It's a continuum. So you've got a mandatory vaccine policy, you've got incentive programs, or you've got low risk alternatives that might be more based on education and safety protocols. So I think all of those have considerations that you should weigh, and it's all about risk adverseness and all about what your employee workforce will tolerate, because that's a big factor as well. So if you have any other questions, I'm happy to entertain them. Otherwise, we'll be getting this PowerPoint out to you, and I feel like it was some quick talking, but hopefully I got through your questions and you feel like you have a good basis of knowledge on this issue now. If you do have additional questions later, please feel free to reach out to me. On the ACCG side, I manage the helpline. GMA has a similar service, but cities are still welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to take your calls and emails. And then, of course, remember that things change quickly in this environment. So keep your ear to the ground for anything new that might be coming out.